Was your high school Latin class tough? Did you ever dream of escaping the declensions and conjugations? What if we told you it could be far, far worse? Step back into the Dark Ages, around 500 C to 1500 CE, and prepare for a linguistic journey you would not wish on your worst enemy. Number 10. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Medieval school discipline was no joke. Learning Latin in the Middle Ages often came with a side of pain. Schoolmasters, frequently monks or priests, believed that breaking a child's spirit, or at least their backside, was the quickest way to instill knowledge. This was not a system of gentle encouragement or understanding a child's learning style. This was about absolute obedience and the swift correction of any perceived misstep. A student forgetting a declension, mispronouncing a word, or even just looking bored could face a swift and brutal punishment. The instruments of this education were readily available: birch rods, switches, or even leather straps. These were not just symbolic threats. They were used regularly and without hesitation. Many accounts from the period describe the widespread nature of corporal punishment. One 11th century monk, Guibert of Nogent, wrote about his own schooling, describing how his master would beat him with his fist or a rod. This was not an isolated incident, but a common experience for many students. Teachers saw their role as not just imparting knowledge, but also enforcing moral discipline. And in their eyes, the best way to do that was through physical coercion. A child's natural restlessness or difficulty with a complex Latin grammatical rule was often interpreted as a sign of stubbornness or laziness requiring immediate and painful intervention. The idea was that pain would etch the lesson into the student's memory more effectively than any spoken word. Schools were not comfortable, nurturing environments. They were places of strict hierarchy and often fear. Students, many of them young boys, sent away from their families to monastic or cathedral schools, lived under constant threat of physical correction. Imagine trying to concentrate on the intricacies of Latin irregular verbs while knowing that a single mistake could lead to a painful lash across your hands or back. This constant anxiety could hardly have fostered a love of learning. Instead, it likely produced resentment, fear, and a desperate desire to avoid making errors at all costs. The goal shifted from understanding the material to simply avoiding punishment. There were few, if any, alternatives to this harsh approach. Concept of child psychology, or pedagogical methods focused on engagement, was centuries away. Teachers had often been educated in the same brutal fashion themselves, perpetuating a cycle of violence. They believed they were acting in the best interests of the child, both for their academic progress and their spiritual salvation. Sparing the rod, it was believed, spoiled the child, both literally and figuratively. This philosophy extended beyond the classroom walls and into the broader society. Discipline was harsh everywhere, and schools were no exception. The physical pain was only part of the ordeal. There was also the public humiliation. Beatings often took place in front of other students, serving as a stark warning to anyone else contemplating a similar mistake. This added another layer of psychological pressure. A student's dignity was rarely considered. The focus was on breaking their will and forcing compliance. This environment could hardly have been conducive to creative thought or a deep appreciation of classical literature. It was about rote memorization under duress, a grim and unyielding process. Students learned that silence and conformity were safer than asking questions or admitting confusion. Consider the physical toll these punishments took. Repeated beatings could leave lasting marks, not just on the body, but on the mind. Fear could stifle curiosity and make learning a truly dreadful experience. Many accounts speak of students suffering from physical injuries due to excessive corporal punishment. Some masters were notoriously cruel, their reputations spreading among the local communities. Parents, if they had a choice, might try to find a less brutal school, but options were often limited. For many, the local monastery or cathedral school was the only place to get an education, and with it came the inevitable rod. The expectation was that students would internalize the rules, not through reasoning, but through fear. This approach made the already complex task of learning Latin even more daunting. Every lesson, every recitation, every translation became a high-stakes performance where the penalty for failure was immediate and painful. This was not just about getting good grades. It was about avoiding a physical assault. The pursuit of knowledge became intertwined with the very real threat of bodily harm. The memories of such schooling likely haunted many former students for years, long after they had mastered their declensions. The contrast with modern educational ideals could not be starker. Today, we understand that a nurturing environment is crucial for effective learning. In the Middle Ages, however, the dominant belief was that suffering purified the soul and sharpened the mind. This applied especially to children, who were often seen as inherently sinful and in need of strict guidance. Latin, being the language of the church and of higher learning, was considered too important to be treated with leniency. Mastering it was seen as a rigorous, almost ascetic journey, and pain was simply a part of that journey. This constant threat of physical discipline shaped the entire learning process. Students learned quickly to be silent, to conform, and to appear to know what they were doing, even if they did not fully understand. They learned to anticipate their master's moods and to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Such an atmosphere could not foster true understanding or a genuine intellectual curiosity. It was about survival and the performance of knowledge, rather than its true acquisition. The Latin learned in this environment was often learned by rote, driven by fear rather than by genuine interest or a deep appreciation for its beauty and utility. This made the already arduous task of learning Latin a truly nightmarish experience for many medieval students. Number 9. Scrolls. Scrolls, learning Latin without books, was the real struggle. Imagine trying to learn a new language today without textbooks, dictionaries, or even paper. That was the grim reality for many medieval students attempting to master Latin. The world before the printing press, specifically before the mid-15th century, was a world where books were incredibly rare, precious, and expensive commodities. Each book, whether a Bible, a classical text, or a grammar treatise, was a unique manuscript, painstakingly copied by hand, usually by monks in a monastery scriptorium. This meant that the number of available books was incredibly limited, and their cost was astronomical. For a student in a medieval school, this scarcity translated directly into a profound lack of learning materials. There were no mass-produced primers or workbooks that students could take home and study. Most schools, even well-funded cathedral schools, would possess only a handful of essential texts. A grammar book, perhaps, a copy of Donatus's Ars Minor or Priscian's Institutiones Grammaticae, would be a prized possession chained to a desk in the schoolroom or library. Allowing only supervised access, students could not simply grab a book and flip through it. They had to rely on the teacher's voice, dictation, and their own memory. This absence of personal books meant that learning was primarily an auditory and oral process. The teacher would read out passages, declensions, or conjugations, and the students would repeat them, often in a chorus. Rote memorization was not just a teaching method. It was a necessity driven by the lack of readily available written materials. Students had to absorb everything through listening and commit it to memory, as there was no text they could refer to later to clarify a point or refresh their recollection. This put immense pressure on their auditory memory and their ability to concentrate for long periods. Even if a student managed to get access to a manuscript, it was often in an unfamiliar script, written without spaces between words and lacking punctuation. This made deciphering the text an additional challenge, adding another layer of difficulty to the already complex task of understanding Latin. There were no helpful footnotes, no glossaries, and certainly no indexed sections for easy reference. A single page of a medieval manuscript could be dense, overwhelming, and incredibly difficult to read, especially for a novice. The act of reading itself was an arduous task, let alone comprehending the content. The cost of books was a major barrier. Parchment, made from animal skins, was expensive to produce. The ink had to be mixed, and scribes dedicated years to mastering the art of copying. A single large book could take months or even years to complete. Only the wealthiest institutions or individuals could afford a substantial library. This meant that the vast majority of students, especially those from poorer backgrounds, would never own a book of their own. Their entire education depended on the shared, limited resources of the school and the instruction given by the master. Without personal copies, students could not prepare for lessons in advance, nor could they review material independently. All learning had to happen in the classroom under the direct supervision of the teacher. This limited the pace of instruction to the slowest student and left little room for individual learning styles or extra practice. If a student missed something or needed more time to grasp a concept, they had to rely on the teacher to repeat it, or hope a fellow student could share their limited notes. The opportunity for self-directed study, a cornerstone of modern learning, was practically non-existent. Note-taking was also a challenge. Parchment was too expensive for everyday note-taking. Students might use wax tablets which could be scraped clean and reused, or perhaps small, cheap scraps of vellum, or even wood. These were temporary solutions, not permanent records. This meant that students often had to rely on their memory to retain complex grammatical rules, vocabulary, and passages of text. There was no going back to highlight a difficult section or to review a particular example. The information had to be committed to memory the first time it was heard. The scarcity of books also meant a limited curriculum. Schools could only teach from the texts they possessed. If a school lacked a copy of a particular classical author or a specific theological treatise, students would simply not be exposed to it. This narrowed the intellectual horizons of many students and ensured that their knowledge of Latin was often derived from a very specific and limited set of sources. The breadth of Latin literature and scholarship was immense, but only a tiny fraction of it was accessible to most students. The idea of lookup was almost foreign. If a student encountered an unfamiliar Latin word, they could not simply open a dictionary. Dictionaries, as we know them, were not common. Instead, they might rely on a glossary appended to a text, or more likely, they would have to ask their teacher or an older student. This process was slow and cumbersome, hindering the flow of learning and reinforcing the teacher's role as the sole repository of knowledge. The path to understanding was often blocked by missing information, and the tools to find that information independently were not available. The struggle to learn Latin without abundant books was a significant hurdle. It made the process intensely difficult, reliant on pure memorization and the spoken word. It limited access to knowledge, prolonged the learning process, and placed enormous pressure on students' memories. It was a world where information was whispered, dictated, and painstakingly copied rather than readily printed and distributed. For a medieval student, the absence of books was not just an inconvenience. It was a fundamental obstacle that transformed the pursuit of Latin into an arduous and often frustrating ordeal. Number 8. Chant it, copy it, repeat it. The soul-crushing monotony of medieval Latin lessons. Imagine a classroom where the same words are repeated over and over, where the primary activity is copying text by hand, and where innovation in teaching methods is as rare as a warm winter day. This was the reality of learning Latin in the Middle Ages, an experience often defined by mind-numbing monotony and endless repetition. Prevailing teaching methods were based on rote memorization and mechanical copying, with little room for creativity, critical thinking, or genuine engagement with the language. This approach, while effective for instilling basic grammar, often drained any joy or intellectual curiosity from the learning process. Students would spend hours chanting grammatical rules, verb conjugations, and noun declensions. The teacher would recite a pattern, and the students would echo it in unison, again and again, until the sounds and forms were supposedly etched into their memories. Think of endless drills: amo, amas, amat, amanus, amatus, amant, then sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt, and so on for every tense, every mood, every irregular verb. This wasn't about understanding the underlying logic of the language or its nuances. It was about sheer brute force memorization, turning students into human phonographs. The goal was to produce correct forms automatically, without hesitation. Beyond chanting, copying was another cornerstone of medieval Latin education. Students would spend countless hours meticulously copying texts onto wax tablets or precious scraps of parchment. This could involve copying grammatical rules, passages from classical authors like Virgil or Ovid, or excerpts from the Bible. The act of copying was seen as a way to reinforce learning, to internalize the forms and vocabulary through the physical act of writing. However, it was also an incredibly tedious and laborious process. Students had to pay close attention to every letter, every stroke, ensuring accuracy, but often without truly comprehending the deeper meaning of the text they were transcribing. The lack of diverse teaching materials compounded this monotony. With few books available, lessons often revolved around a limited set of core texts. Donatus's Ars Minor, a basic Latin grammar from the 4th century, was a staple. Students would go through its rules repeatedly, perhaps never moving beyond the fundamentals for a long time. Priscian's more comprehensive Institutiones Grammaticae was also widely used, but its complexity meant that only advanced students or masters truly grasped its entirety. The curriculum was rigid, and the progression through it was slow and methodical, often feeling glacial. There were few opportunities for interactive learning, discussions, or creative exercises. The teacher was the authority, the dispenser of knowledge, and the students were passive recipients. Questioning or debating was rarely encouraged, as it could be seen as a challenge to authority. The focus was on correctness and adherence to established rules, not on exploration or individual interpretation. This left little room for students to develop a genuine passion for the language, or to appreciate its literary richness. It was a utilitarian endeavor, designed to equip them with the tools for religious service or administration, not necessarily to foster intellectual curiosity. The daily routine was largely unvarying. Mornings would be spent on grammar drills, afternoons on copying or translating. Quiet hum of chanting filled the schoolrooms, interrupted only by the scratch of quills or the sharp crack of a master's rod. This predictable, unstimulating environment could easily lead to boredom, distraction, and mental fatigue. For a young mind, the prospect of hours of repetitive tasks, without much stimulation or variation, must have felt like a form of linguistic purgatory. The challenge was not just to learn Latin, but to endure the process of learning it. Even learning vocabulary was often a monotonous affair. Word lists were rare, and learning new words typically involved encountering them in texts or through the teacher's dictation. Students would have to memorize meanings through repetition, sometimes with a brief vernacular gloss provided by the teacher. There were no engaging vocabulary games, no visual aids, and certainly no multimedia resources. It was a purely cognitive effort, demanding immense discipline and tolerance for monotony. The sheer volume of new words, combined with complex grammar, made this an uphill battle. The absence of play or creative application of the language further contributed to the drudgery. Latin was learned for serious purposes, for reading scripture, for liturgical services, for legal documents, or for scholarly discourse. It was not learned for fun or for creative expression in the way a modern language learner might engage with songs, movies, or casual conversation. Playful aspect of language which can make learning enjoyable and effective was entirely absent. This made the acquisition of Latin a chore, a necessary evil, rather than a fascinating journey. Students might spend years in this repetitive cycle, gaining a solid, if uninspired, grasp of the language. The sheer volume of repetition, combined with the harsh discipline, ensured that the rules eventually stuck. But what was lost in the process was often a genuine love for learning. The monotonous methods produced competent Latinists, but rarely enthusiastic ones. Classroom was a factory, producing individuals who could read and write the sacred and scholarly texts, but perhaps without ever truly appreciating the beauty or power of the language they had mastered. This relentless drudgery made the Latin learning experience truly a nightmare for many who endured it. Number 7. Speaking like a barbarian. Nobody knew how to really speak Latin anymore. Imagine trying to learn a language only to discover that no one around you speaks it natively, and everyone has a different idea of how it should sound. This was a profound challenge for anyone learning Latin in the Middle Ages. By this period, Latin was no longer a living, spoken language for the common people in any region of Europe. The vulgar Latin spoken by the Roman populace had evolved into the various Romance languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and others. Classical Latin, the language of Cicero and Virgil, became primarily a written, scholarly, and liturgical language. This created a huge hurdle for medieval students: pronunciation. Without native speakers, there was no single, universally accepted way to pronounce Latin. Instead, pronunciation varied wildly from region to region, influenced by the vernacular languages spoken by the teachers and students. A monk in England might pronounce Latin very differently from a scholar in Italy or a student in Germany. This meant that while the written word of Latin provided a common ground, the spoken word became a Tower of Babel. If you learned Latin pronunciation in a Parisian monastery, you might struggle to understand a sermon delivered in Latin by a priest from Seville, even if both were reading the same text. This lack of standardized pronunciation created confusion and practical difficulties. How do you teach a language when the correct way to speak it is a matter of local convention? Teachers would often pronounce Latin words using the phonetic rules of their own native tongue. So a French speaker might pronounce C before E or I as an ENS sound, while a German speaker might pronounce it as a K sound. Even for words like centum vowel, sounds also differed wildly. This meant that while the grammar and vocabulary were shared, the auditory experience of Latin was incredibly diverse and often mutually unintelligible across regions. For a student is presented a dilemma. They would learn the pronunciation style of their local teacher, which would be sufficient for reading aloud in their own school or church. However, if they traveled for further study or encountered scholars from other regions, they would quickly discover that their carefully learned pronunciation was wrong according to others. This could lead to misunderstandings, frustration, and a sense of linguistic isolation. It underscored the fact that Latin, while intellectually unifying, was no longer a fluid, naturally spoken medium of communication in the same way it had been in antiquity. Furthermore, without the opportunity to hear Latin spoken in natural conversation, students lacked exposure to its rhythm, intonation, and practical usage. They might learn to translate written texts with great accuracy, but they would struggle to compose original Latin prose or engage in spontaneous Latin discourse. The language was often taught as a static, almost mathematical system of rules, rather than as a dynamic tool for communication. This made it feel artificial and detached from real life, a purely academic exercise. The focus in medieval Latin education was heavily on reading and writing, not speaking. Students were expected to be able to read and understand theological treatises, philosophical arguments, legal documents, and classical literature. They were also expected to be able to compose their own Latin texts for scholarly or administrative purposes. Speaking Latin was often limited to liturgical chanting or formal academic disputations, which followed highly ritualized patterns and relied on prepared phrases. Casual conversation in Latin was rare, even among highly educated individuals. This emphasis on the written word meant that students were deprived of the immersive experience that is so crucial for mastering any language. They could not pick up nuances of expression, idiomatic phrases, or the subtle flow of conversation that native speakers develop naturally. Their Latin was often stiff, formal, and strictly grammatical, lacking the fluidity and naturalness of a living language. It was a language learned from books, not from the mouths of people. The historical development also played a part. As vulgar Latin diversified into the Romance languages, the disconnect between spoken vernaculars and formal learned Latin grew. This made it harder for children to connect the language they were learning in school to anything they heard outside of it. The gap between their mother tongue and the Latin of the classroom was immense, making the learning process feel even more alien and difficult. They were not just learning a new vocabulary. They were learning an entirely different linguistic universe. Even within a single school, the teacher might be the only one who spoke Latin regularly, and even then, often with the heavy accent of their own vernacular. Students were learning from a second-hand source, a language filtered through the phonetic habits of another. This meant that true fluency, in the sense of being able to speak Latin naturally and spontaneously, was an incredibly rare achievement, confined to a very select few who dedicated their lives to its mastery and spent time with other scholars from different regions. For the average student, Latin was a language to be read and written, not truly spoken. This made learning Latin in the Middle Ages a truly abstract exercise. It was a language without a homeland, without native speakers, and without a consistent sound. Students were learning a ghost of a language, a set of symbols and rules that held immense power and prestige, but which no one could truly speak as a living tongue. This strange, disembodied nature of Latin only added to the difficulty and the somewhat nightmarish quality of trying to master it. Number 6. Cases, genders, and moods. Oh my! The absolute mind melt of Latin grammar. If you thought Latin grammar was tough in high school, try learning it in the Middle Ages without the benefit of clear textbooks, helpful diagrams, or patient explanations. Latin grammar is notoriously complex, a labyrinth of inflections, declensions, conjugations, genders, and cases that can make a modern learner's head spin. For medieval students, this complexity was amplified by harsh teaching methods and limited resources, turning the grammatical rules into an absolute mind melt. At the heart of Latin's difficulty are its inflections. Unlike English, where word order largely determines meaning, e.g., the dog bites the man, vs. the man bites the dog, Latin relies on word endings. A noun's ending changes depending on its function in the sentence. Is it the subject, the direct object, the indirect object, or showing possession? These are called cases, and Latin has 6 of them: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, vocative, each with specific endings for singular and plural forms. And these endings vary, depending on the noun's declension, its group or family, and its gender: masculine, feminine, or neuter. For a student, this meant memorizing an enormous number of endings. There are 5 main declensions for nouns, and each has a different set of 6 singular and 6 plural endings for its cases. Then add in 3 genders, which further complicate things, as adjectives must agree in gender, number, and case with the nouns they modify. This is not a simple task. A single noun could have 12 different forms, and an adjective accompanying it would need to match. This required an almost superhuman feat of memorization for every new word encountered. Verbs are even more complex. Latin verbs are conjugated, meaning their endings change to indicate person. I, you, he, she, it. Number, singular, plural tense, present, past, future, mood, indicative, subjunctive, imperative, and voice, active, passive. There are 4 main conjugations, plus a host of irregular verbs that follow no predictable pattern. For each verb, a student had to learn dozens of forms. For example, a single verb like ammo, I love, could have forms like amavit, he, she had loved, amameter, he, she, it will be loved, amerm, I might love, ama. The sheer volume of forms to memorize was staggering, a mountain of linguistic data that had to be perfectly recalled. Medieval teaching, as discussed, often relied on rote memorization. Students would chant these paradigms for hours, day after day. There was little opportunity for conceptual understanding. It was about drilling the forms until they could be recited flawlessly. A slight error in an ending could completely change the meaning of a sentence, or worse, invite the teacher's rod. This intense pressure made grasping the underlying logic of the grammar even harder. The focus was on mechanical reproduction, not deep comprehension. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that many students were learning Latin from a very young age, often as boys sent to monastic or cathedral schools. Their native languages. The nascent vernaculars were developing and had simpler grammatical structures. The leap from their mother tongue to the highly inflected, grammatically precise Latin was immense. They weren't just learning a new vocabulary. They were learning a completely different way of structuring thought and expression. It was like switching from basic arithmetic to advanced calculus overnight without much foundational support. Adding to the complexity were the impersonal verbs, the gerunds and gerundives, the supines and the absolute constructions. These nuanced grammatical features added layers of difficulty, requiring students to grasp subtle distinctions in meaning and usage. Even advanced students struggled with these finer points. The Latin prose of authors like Cicero, with its long, complex sentences and intricate subordinate clauses, was a masterpiece of grammatical construction, but a nightmare for anyone trying to parse it word by word, inflection by inflection. Furthermore, medieval grammar texts themselves were often dense and lacked clarity by modern standards. Works like Donatus's Ars Minor provided the rules, but without the extensive examples or pedagogical aids that modern textbooks offer. Students had to rely heavily on the teacher's interpretation and dictation, trying to make sense of abstract rules without seeing them applied in a wide variety of contexts. Concept of diagramming sentences or breaking down complex structures visually was not part of the standard teaching suite. The sheer volume of material to master was overwhelming. Student wasn't just learning isolated words, they were learning systems of endings, rules of agreement, and patterns of change that applied to thousands of words. It was like trying to learn the rules of a complex game where every piece has multiple ways it can move, and every move affects other pieces, all while being told to remember everything perfectly or face consequences. This constant mental strain, trying to keep all these intricate rules straight, was a significant part of the nightmare of medieval Latin learning. Many students probably never truly mastered all the nuances of Latin grammar. They learned enough to read basic texts, participate in church services, and write simple documents. But reaching a level of true fluency, where the inflections and conjugations became second nature, was a rare and arduous achievement. The grammatical complexity of Latin, combined with the era's teaching methods, made it a formidable, often soul-crushing intellectual challenge for students. It was truly a mind melt demanding extraordinary memory and resilience from those who dared to tackle it. Number 5. Locked away with books. The monastery life was not your average school trip. For many medieval students, learning Latin meant entering a world far removed from their homes and families. The monastery. These were not open campuses with student unions and sports fields. Monasteries and cathedral schools were often austere, isolated institutions with incredibly strict routines where discipline and devotion were paramount. This environment, while fostering concentration, was also profoundly isolating and demanding, turning the pursuit of Latin into an all-encompassing, often suffocating experience. Life in a medieval monastery followed the rule of Saint Benedict, or similar monastic rules, which dictated every hour of the day and night. Students, often young boys, would rise before dawn, sometimes as early as 2 a.m. for the first canonical hour of prayers, matins. Their day would be a relentless cycle of religious services, study, manual labor, and meager meals with very little free time or personal space. The silence was often enforced, and conversation was limited and formal. This rigorous schedule left little room for childhood play or the natural exuberance of youth. Primary purpose of monastic education was to prepare boys for a life of religious service, either as monks, priests, or scholars within the church. Latin was the language of the church, of scripture, and of all theological and philosophical discourse. Therefore, mastering Latin was not just an academic goal, it was a spiritual imperative. This added an immense layer of pressure to the learning process. Failure to grasp Latin was not just an academic failure, but a failure to serve God properly. The environment itself was designed to minimize distractions from worldly affairs. Monasteries were typically self-sufficient communities, often located in remote areas. Communication with the outside world was limited. Students were cut off from their families for long periods, sometimes permanently. This isolation, while intended to foster spiritual focus, could also be incredibly lonely and challenging, especially for young boys who might have been sent away from home at a tender age, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old. Study periods were long and intense. Students would spend hours poring over Latin texts, often in cold, poorly lit rooms. The emphasis was on silent contemplation and rigorous memorization. Teachers themselves, monks or priests, expected absolute dedication and intellectual discipline. There was no room for idleness or superficial effort. Intellectual pursuits were intertwined with spiritual discipline, meaning that mental fatigue could be seen as a sign of weakness or a lack of devotion. The communal living arrangements offered little privacy. Students slept in dormitories, ate in refectories, and studied in common rooms. Every aspect of their lives was structured and supervised. There were no personal possessions beyond the bare necessities. This communal, highly regulated existence was a stark contrast to the more informal, varied life outside the monastery walls. It was a complete immersion, not just in the Latin language, but in a monastic way of life that was demanding in every conceivable way. Food was often plain and scarce, designed to sustain, not to delight. Physical comforts were minimal. Beds were hard, heating was limited to common areas, and cleanliness by modern standards was often lacking. Students were expected to endure these hardships as part of their spiritual and intellectual training. Any complaint or desire for comfort might be seen as a sign of spiritual weakness, further adding to the pressure to conform and suffer in silence. Even the interactions with peers were constrained. While students learned alongside each other, The strict rules of silence and decorum limited casual conversation and the formation of close friendships. The focus was on individual spiritual and intellectual progress within the communal framework, not on social bonding in the way we understand it today. This constant regimentation, combined with the lack of personal freedom, made the monastic learning environment a challenging crucible for any student. Breaking the rules, whether academic or behavioral, carried severe consequences, often involving physical punishment and public humiliation. The monastic environment was one of constant surveillance and strict adherence to a moral code. A student not only had to master the complexities of Latin grammar, but also had to navigate the intricate web of monastic rules, rituals, and expectations. This dual burden made the learning process doubly difficult, as the fear of spiritual or physical retribution loomed constantly. The monastery, for all its dedication to scholarship and the preservation of knowledge, was a harsh and unyielding school. It demanded total commitment, physical endurance, and a suppression of individual desires. For many, learning Latin within its walls was not just an academic challenge, but a profound test of resilience and character. It was an experience of being locked away, immersed in an intense, disciplined world, where the mastery of Latin was inseparable from a life of austere religious devotion, making it a true nightmare for those who found themselves within its formidable walls. Number 4. Squinting in the shadows. Eye, strain, and illness were part of the curriculum. Learning Latin in the Middle Ages was not just an intellectual challenge, it was often a physically taxing ordeal, particularly on a student's eyesight and overall health. Medieval classrooms, especially those in monasteries or castle scriptoria, were far from the well-lit, climate-controlled environments we know today. Students spent countless hours poring over dense manuscripts in dim, flickering light under conditions that were ripe for eye strain, musculoskeletal problems, and the spread of illness. Artificial light sources were incredibly limited and expensive. Candles and oil lamps provided meager illumination, and their light was often uneven and cast long shadows. Most work, especially copying and reading, relied on natural daylight. This meant that study hours were often dictated by the sun. As daylight faded, so too did the ability to read or write. During the shorter days of winter, learning time was severely curtailed, or students were forced to strain their eyes in the gloom. The lack of proper light made deciphering often faint script or intricate illuminations a constant struggle. Students, particularly those learning to be scribes, would spend hours hunched over desks or sloped reading stands, meticulously copying Latin texts. This posture, combined with the poor lighting, was a recipe for chronic eye strain, headaches, and often lifelong vision problems. Imagine trying to distinguish between similar-looking letters like I and lor and n, me, in a dimly lit room, focusing intently for hours on end. The constant effort to see clearly would have been exhausting and painful. Medieval eyesight would have been put to the ultimate test, and many would have suffered the consequences. Beyond eye strain, the physical conditions of medieval schools and monasteries were often harsh. Heating was minimal, typically from a single fireplace in a common room, meaning most areas were cold and drafty, especially in winter. Sanitation was rudimentary. Personal hygiene was not practiced to modern standards. Communal living in close quarters, combined with poor nutrition, made these environments breeding grounds for disease. A simple cold could quickly spread through an entire school, leading to widespread illness. More serious diseases, like dysentery or various fevers, could decimate student populations, and without modern medicine, recovery was often slow or impossible. Students were often malnourished. The food provided in monasteries or schools was usually simple, repetitive, and often insufficient in terms of variety and nutrients. It was designed for sustenance, not optimal health or energy. A diet lacking in fresh fruits, vegetables, and sufficient protein would have left students with weakened immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness and less able to concentrate on their studies. Constantly hungry or unwell student would have found the rigors of Latin grammar even more challenging. The physical act of writing itself was demanding. Quills needed to be sharpened constantly, ink had to be mixed, and parchment was often rough and difficult to write on. Students might develop calluses or cramps in their hands from the continuous effort. Posture required for copying, often bent over a desk, could lead to back pain, neck stiffness, and other musculoskeletal issues, sometimes developing into chronic conditions. This physical discomfort was a constant companion to the mental exertion of learning Latin. Cold, damp conditions also contributed to various ailments. Respiratory infections were common. Skin conditions and parasites were also prevalent. Due to limited bathing facilities and poor hygiene, students were expected to endure these discomforts without complaint as part of their training in asceticism and self-discipline. The idea that comfort and good health contribute to better learning was not a widely held concept. Instead, physical hardship was often seen as character building. The lack of proper medical care meant that even minor ailments could become serious. A severe eye infection, for example, could lead to permanent vision loss, effectively ending a student's academic career. There were no eyeglasses, no optometrists, and very few effective treatments for common illnesses. A sick student was often simply left to recover or succumb to their illness, with little intervention beyond basic nursing. This made learning Latin a risky endeavor, where physical well-being was constantly at stake. The silent, sedentary nature of much of the learning process also contributed to poor health. While some monasteries involved manual labor, much of a student's day was spent sitting or standing in one place focused on their books. There was limited opportunity for physical exercise or movement, which is essential for overall health and well-being. This created an environment where students were often physically stagnant while mentally overworked. Ultimately, the physical environment and the poor health conditions of medieval schools added a significant, unspoken burden to the task of learning Latin. Students were not just battling complex grammar. They were battling poor lighting, cold, hunger, and disease. This constant struggle against physical discomfort and ailments made the already arduous journey of mastering Latin a truly nightmarish and often painful experience for those who endured it. Number 3. More than just words. Latin was your ticket to everything, but the price was steep. Learning Latin in the Middle Ages was never just about mastering a language. It was the key to virtually all knowledge, power, and advancement in society. Latin was the universal language of the church, of law, of government, of scholarship, and of international communication. This meant that mastering Latin was not merely an academic exercise. It was a fundamental necessity for anyone aspiring to a meaningful career beyond manual labor. The immense weight of this expectation, combined with the vast amount of knowledge conveyed through Latin, made the learning process incredibly steep and intimidating. If you wanted to be a priest, a monk, a lawyer, a government official, a doctor, or a scholar, you had to know Latin. There was no alternative. All sermons were delivered in Latin. All legal documents were written in Latin. All philosophical and scientific treatises were composed in Latin. All communication between kingdoms, churches, and universities happened in Latin. This meant that Latin was not just a subject. It was the medium through which all other subjects were learned. To learn about theology, logic, rhetoric, astronomy, or medicine, one first had to conquer the linguistic barrier of Latin. This meant the curriculum for a Latin student extended far beyond mere grammar and vocabulary. Once a student had a foundational grasp of the language, they were expected to delve into the liberal arts, a curriculum inherited from antiquity. This typically included the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Each of these subjects was studied through Latin texts, requiring students to not only understand the Latin, but also grasp complex concepts in diverse fields. Grammar, of course, was the starting point, building the foundation of the language. Then came rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, which required an understanding of classical authors like Cicero and Quintilian, whose Latin was highly sophisticated and demanding. Logic involved studying the works of Aristotle through Latin translations. A rigorous intellectual discipline focused on valid reasoning and argumentation. Mastering these two arts meant navigating intricate Latin prose and philosophical concepts. Beyond the trivium, the quadrivium introduced scientific and mathematical subjects, again, all in Latin. Arithmetic was studied through Latin treatises, often dealing with complex calculations needed for church calendars or commercial transactions. Geometry involved the study of Euclid's elements translated into Latin. Astronomy required understanding complex theories about the cosmos, all described in Latin texts. Music theory, too, was taught through Latin treatises, focusing on harmony and chants. The sheer breadth of this knowledge, all mediated through a non-native language, was truly daunting. Students were expected to not only read and understand these complex texts, but also to be able to discuss them, write about them, and even argue about them in Latin. Public disputations or formal debates were a common feature of advanced learning, especially in universities that began to emerge later in the Middle Ages. These required not just mastery of the subject matter, but also the ability to think and speak spontaneously in Latin, crafting persuasive arguments on the spot. The pressure to master Latin was immense, because one's entire future depended on it. A student failing to grasp Latin was essentially doomed to a life of limited opportunity, excluded from the intellectual, ecclesiastical, and administrative elite. There were no alternative paths to higher education or prestigious careers in the vernacular languages. Those languages were largely unstandardized and not yet equipped for complex academic discourse. Latin was the sole gateway. This high-stakes environment made the learning process incredibly stressful. It was not just about passing an exam, it was about securing one's future. The burden of this societal expectation weighed heavily on students, adding to the already significant challenge of mastering a complex, inflected language and the vast curriculum associated. Price of entry into the educated world was total immersion and mastery of Latin, a price few could pay without immense effort and often suffering. The demanding curriculum meant that medieval education was often long and arduous, spanning many years. Students would spend their childhood and early adulthood immersed in these studies, gradually building their knowledge base. The process was slow, methodical, and required incredible dedication. The idea of a quick language course was absurd. This was a lifelong commitment to the intellectual tradition embodied by Latin. Ultimately, Latin was the operating system of the medieval world for the educated elite. To function within that system, one had to become fluent in its language and conversant with the vast amount of information contained within it. Price for this access was high. Years of demanding study, mental exertion, and the mastery of not just a language, but an entire universe of knowledge transmitted through that language. This made the Latin learning experience an exceptionally formidable, and for many a nightmarish journey. Number 2. Fail Latin, fail life. The intense pressure to master the language of power. In the Middle Ages, Latin was not just a school subject. It was the ultimate gatekeeper. Failing to master Latin meant more than just a bad grade. It could literally mean the difference between a life of influence and a life of obscurity. This intense societal pressure to become proficient in the language of power added an enormous, often terrifying burden to the learning process, transforming it from an academic pursuit into a high-stakes struggle for social survival and advancement. Latin was the official language of the Roman Catholic Church, which was the dominant power structure across Western Europe. All religious services, all theological debates, all papal decrees, and all ecclesiastical laws were in Latin. If you aspired to be a priest, a bishop, or any member of the clergy, Latin was non-negotiable. Without it, you could not read the Bible, understand the liturgy, or communicate with the wider church hierarchy. This meant that Latin was essential for anyone seeking spiritual authority or a career within the most influential institution of the time. Beyond the church, Latin was the language of law. Legal codes, court proceedings, charters, and treaties were all recorded in Latin. If you wanted to practice law, work in the burgeoning legal systems, or even understand your own rights or obligations, you needed Latin. Similarly, in burgeoning royal and noble courts, Latin was the language of administration and diplomacy. State documents, correspondence between rulers, and records of governance were kept in Latin. To serve in government, to be a secretary, or to hold any significant administrative post, Latin was indispensable. Furthermore, Latin was the sole language of scholarship and higher learning. All universities, once they began to emerge, conducted their teaching, lectures, and academic debates in Latin. All philosophical texts, medical treatises, scientific inquiries, and historical chronicles were written in Latin. If you desired to be a scholar, a doctor, a philosopher, or a university master, you had to be fluent in Latin. It was the international language of the learned, allowing scholars from different regions to communicate and share knowledge. Without Latin, access to this entire intellectual world was simply impossible. The stark reality was that the vernacular languages of Europe, early forms of English, French, German, and others, were largely unstandardized, often not written down and considered unsuitable for serious academic or professional discourse. They lacked the vocabulary and grammatical precision needed for complex concepts. To be educated meant to know Latin. Not knowing Latin meant being largely excluded from the elite, from positions of power, influence, and intellectual pursuit. It was a barrier that few could overcome. This put immense pressure on students and their families. For a poor family, sending a son to a monastic or cathedral school to learn Latin was a significant investment, a desperate hope for social mobility. The failure of that son to master Latin could mean the collapse of those hopes, sending him back to a life of manual labor or obscurity. The stakes were incredibly high, much higher than simply getting a good grade in a modern language class. It was often a matter of social and economic destiny. The fear of failure was a constant companion for medieval Latin students. Consequences were not just academic, they were existential. A student who consistently struggled with Latin might be deemed unsuitable for the clergy or for administrative roles, effectively ending their path to advancement. This pressure was often reinforced by the harsh discipline of the schools, where corporal punishment served as a constant reminder of the importance of mastering the language. The rod was not just for academic errors, but for any perceived lack of effort or dedication. This profound societal pressure meant that learning Latin was rarely approached with light-heartedness or enjoyment. It was a serious, almost sacred duty. Students were keenly aware that their future, their status, and their very livelihood depended on their ability to read, write, and understand this ancient tongue. The weight of this expectation, coupled with the inherent difficulty of Latin grammar, the scarcity of resources, and the harsh teaching methods, made the learning process a truly daunting and often nightmarish ordeal for those who embarked upon it. For many, failing Latin truly meant failing life in medieval society. Number 1. Just keep copying. the endless drudgery of becoming a Latin scholar. Imagine spending your days, month after month, year after year, engaged in the repetitive, painstaking physical act of copying text by hand. This was the ultimate reality for many medieval Latin learners, especially those destined to become scribes or monks in a monastery. The endless drudgery of transcription, coupled with the rigid, unstimulating nature of medieval education, often drained any sense of joy or intellectual spark from the process of becoming a Latin scholar. It was a life defined by meticulous, monotonous labor, where the pursuit of knowledge was inextricably linked to physical toil. For centuries before the printing press, every single book, every legal document, every religious text, and every scholarly treatise had to be copied by hand. Monasteries were the primary centers of this activity, and monks or lay scribes trained in the scriptorium dedicated their lives to it. Students learning Latin were often put to work in these scriptoria from an early age, learning the language as they copied it. This meant that a significant portion of their learning time was spent in the quiet, often cold atmosphere of the copying room, meticulously reproducing words line by line, page by page. The process of copying was slow and demanding. A scribe would sit for hours, often in an uncomfortable position, focused intently on the manuscript before them. They would use a quill pen, which needed constant sharpening, and carefully prepared ink. Parchment, made from animal skins, was expensive and had to be prepared correctly, often being rough or uneven. Every letter had to be formed precisely, every word copied accurately. A single mistake could ruin an entire page, necessitating painstaking erasure or even the discarding of a whole sheet of expensive parchment. This was not simply about learning grammar. It was about the physical exertion of writing. The hands would cramp, the eyes would strain in the dim light, and the back would ache from prolonged sitting. Scribes often developed specific physical ailments related to their work, from eye problems to repetitive strain injuries. This physical discomfort was a constant companion to the mental effort required for accurate transcription. It was a labor-intensive way to absorb Latin, making the learning process less about intellectual discovery and more about physical endurance. The sheer volume of copying was immense. A large book could take months, or even a year, for a single scribe to complete. A student learning Latin might start with simple texts, but would eventually be expected to copy complex philosophical works or lengthy biblical commentaries. This meant that the student's day was often dominated by the silent, solitary act of writing, leaving little time or energy for engaging discussion, creative interpretation, or deeper understanding of the text's content. The focus was on precise reproduction, not necessarily on critical analysis. Furthermore, copying was often a solitary activity. While working in a scriptorium, communication was typically forbidden or kept to an absolute minimum. Students were expected to concentrate solely on their task. This silence, combined with the repetitive nature of the work, could be incredibly isolating. There was little opportunity for peer interaction or collaborative learning, which can often make learning a language more engaging. It was a private battle with the text, demanding immense self-discipline and tolerance for monotony. The lack of personal connection to the copied text was also a challenge. Students were not necessarily choosing what they copied. They were assigned tasks by their superiors. This meant they might spend weeks or months copying a text that held little personal interest for them, but which was deemed important for the monastic library or for a patron. This further reduced the intellectual enjoyment of the process, turning it into a purely utilitarian task rather than a passionate pursuit of knowledge. The focus on copying also meant that students' understanding of Latin often remained superficial. While they could reproduce words and sentences correctly, they might not fully grasp the nuances of meaning, the historical context, or the literary artistry of the original author. The act of copying trained them as faithful conduits of information, but not necessarily as insequel interpreters. Their knowledge of Latin was often broad but shallow, gained through mechanical repetition rather than deep intellectual engagement. Even for those not destined to be full-time scribes, copying was a fundamental part of learning. Without widespread printed books, any notes, exercises, or personal reference materials had to be copied by hand. This meant that every student, regardless of their ultimate career path, spent a significant amount of time engaged in this form of drudgery. It was an inescapable aspect of medieval education, a necessary evil that transformed the pursuit of Latin into a laborious and often physically demanding ordeal. Ultimately, the endless, painstaking act of copying was a defining nightmare of learning Latin in the Middle Ages. Turned intellectual growth into a form of physical labor demanding immense patience, endurance, and a willingness to embrace monotony. For many, the journey to becoming a Latin scholar was paved, not with exciting discoveries, but with countless hours of silent, solitary, and physically exhausting transcription.